Hey, Gwen.
Hey, well, should we talk a bit about our favorite topic today?
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah. What if the future of salmon, seabirds, and whales depended on tiny fish you rarely heard about?
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're here today. Because we think forage fish don't always get the attention they deserve. But today, we dedicated a whole presentation to them. So I would like to just share a little bit about why we think they're so important and also what we've been learning about them.
How about we do some introductions?
Good idea.
I'm Jack. My role at Project Watershed is the research manager, and I came into Forage Fish first from a bit of a personal love. I have a sailboat, and I spent a lot of time on the sailboat doing a lot of bird watching, particularly at seabirds, and one in particular, the marbled murrelet, has captured my heart. And it's a really interesting species because it lives most of its life on the water, but it nests in old growth forests. And so it really ties together that like land sea connection. And when I was fishing around for a master's project, I was learning a lot about marbled murrelet. And the more I learned about them, the more I realized there's this glaring gap in understanding their prey. And where are they? How are they doing? And is this part of the story why we're seeing fewer and fewer marbled murrelet? And so that's what brought me into the whole world of forage fish.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, and I'm Gwen, the operations manager at Project Watershed. Before this, while Jack was on maternity leave, I had the chance to fill in for her as the forage fish lead biologist. And I was so happy that you trusted me with your project, Jack. It was probably one of my favorite jobs as a biologist because I got to work with an amazing team and spent my days on boats and beaches. And obviously, somewhere along the way, I became a huge forage fish nerd.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Gwen. I going on maternity leave, it's a bit of a crazy time. And so knowing the project was in your hands and like you're very capable, I was not worried at all. So that felt really good. And yeah, of course, Forge Fish won you over. I'm not surprised at all.
I'm not surprised either. But to be completely honest, before joining Project Watershed, I didn't know much about forage fish at all, which is really surprising when you think of it because these small fish have such a big impact. Um, but probably before we go any further, let's clarify for everyone what we mean when we say forage fish.
Yeah, okay, good idea. So it's a little more complicated than you might think. The one thing I want you all to like remember is what all forage species have in common is that they play a similar role in the ecosystem. Most importantly, they are a great snack for everything else in the ocean. They also tend to be, but not always, small bodied. They're found in large numbers. They are ubiquitous, so like commonly encountered. They are distinctly not plankton. And despite the name forage fish, they're not always fish. So if you think of squid or prawns, and they can also refer to a particular life stage. So think of juvenile salmon or juvenile rockfish. I would say that forage fish has a bit of an identity crisis.
Identity crisis. Hmm. Yeah, I sometimes like to think of forage fish as the middle class of the food web because they eat the really tiny stuff at the bottom of the food web and then they get eaten by a much larger species high up. And if folks are curious, some other common forage fish species we have here in BC include Pacific herring, northern anchovy, and eulachon.
And a fun way to think of forage fish is they are the chicken nuggets of the sea, if you will. So they're small and they're packed with proteins and fats, just like the chicken nuggets. They're often found in groups. Nobody orders just one chicken nugget. And they're typically found in high numbers. So it's very easy to come across in McDonald's.
Well, sounds like everyone would want forage fish for lunch. But because they aren't all fish, don't you think we should call them forage species?
How about a Happy Meal?
A Happy Meal. I like that.
Okay, so but on a more serious vein, I would like to describe them, and I want everyone to remember that they are a bottleneck in the coastal ecosystem of energy transfer. So forage fish, they act as bridges, and they move energy from the sun, which goes to the phytoplankton that are taking up the sun's energy, and then zooplankton. So these are things like euphausids or crustaceans or krill. So they're kind of bigger, and then forage fish eat those. A few other species are able to skip the line, so like gray whales or thick-billed murres. They can eat zooplankton, but most of the top predators that we think about, care about, drive our economies and our cultures must go through this bottleneck of forage fish to get their energy. So that energy flows from the zooplankton up to the top predators.
It's incredible when you think about it. We spend so much time talking about protecting salmon and whales, but protecting them also means protecting what they eat.
Yeah, exactly. If forage fish are healthy, many of the predators are healthy. Maybe we explain an example?
Hmm, good idea. Who here has heard of the blob? Well, the blob was a body of water that was much warmer than usual. So you can think of it as a marine heat wave. And that marine heat wave set off the coast of BC and Alaska from 2014 to 2016. And in some places, seawater was 5 to 7 degrees warmer than normal.
So you might have remembered around that time, maybe more like 2016, 2017, some of the headlines in the news were, mass seabird die-off, or thousands of seabirds have washed ashore, or sea lions looking skinny. And there was also like this mass influx of warmer species, like sea turtles and great white sharks were showing up on the West Coast in these colder waters. Common murres especially were hard hit. And after one storm in Alaska, 47,000 common murre carcasses washed up on shore. So we think that about 1.2 million birds died from this heat wave alone, like common murres specifically. And that's about 50% of their population, which is a total of about 6 million birds. Contrasting that, though, thick-billed murres were not experiencing these major die-offs, and they were able to breed as normal.
Yeah, I think it's important to know here that thick-billed murres eat a very diverse diet of zooplankton and forage fish, but in contrast, common murres primarily feed on forage fish, not much else. So each common murre bird can consume somewhere between 60 to 120 fish every single day.
That's a lot of fish per bird.
It sure is. So what happened is that the blob had a number of cascading effects. The marine heat wave changed the kinds of zooplankton in the area, which meant that the rich, high-fat crustaceans that forage fish love to feed on became less abundant. And instead, they were replaced by lower energy species like jellyfish, which meant that there was an overall reduction in the quality of forage fish in the area.
Yeah, so by the time that energy was able to move through the food web to the apex predators at the top, there just wasn't enough to go around. And so that's what resulted in the die-offs of the common murres, who only eat forage fish, as opposed to the thick-billed murres, who can eat a more diverse diet, and when times are tough, they can eat forage fish, or they can primarily eat zooplankton if they need to. Fun anecdote about this zooplankton communities. Moira Galbraith from Environment and Climate Change Canada, she's like a great like zooplankton, phytoplankton expert. And she likes to describe the crustaceans as the crunchies and the jellies as the squishies. So she gives these talks about the crunchies and the squishies. And you can really see it when you think of it that way, that like the squishies are kind of low energy, there's not a lot to them, but the crunchies, there's a lot more going on there in terms of nutrients and fats.
I love that, the squishies and the crunchies. Okay, but so now what, Jack? Why do we want everyone to care about forage fish?
Yeah, so I think forage fish, like, it's not just a story about cute fish or seabirds. This is actually a story about prioritization. We're living through challenging times, and everyone here knows about the doom and gloom and species loss and climate change. So I don't need to go on about that. And I find that working with forage fish brings a little bit of hope. Because they're a bottleneck in the coastal food web, relatively small actions have the potential to create much bigger impacts on the whole ecosystem. So it allows us to have access to these levers that we can pull to make significant change and prioritize what actions will have the biggest impacts on helping our ecosystems through these challenging times.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack. I feel you put that really well. And that's probably why we are such big forage fish fans, right? Like healthy forage fish populations support so much of what makes our coast so special.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a really good example of how forage fish relates right back to people is if you think about forage fish feed salmon, salmon feed us, but salmon also feed bears and wolves and these like big land predators when they come back to spawn in the fall. And then they move those dead salmon carcasses out of the rivers to the edges of the forests. And these forests are particularly productive, and that supports our forestry industries. And yeah, without forage fish to support lots of salmon, you would see fewer or like a reduction in the forestry fertilization program that nature supports.
Yeah, and the same natural fertilizing program is going on in our oceans. Large baleen whales, for example, rely on forage species too. The whales eat in one place and, well, poop in another. So, in that way, helping to move nutrients around in our oceans and support productive marine ecosystems. It's surprisingly important work.
Yeah, they're like one big pump moving that nutrients around. Yeah, so one thing that I love about working on forage fish is there's still so many questions we're trying to answer. It makes for a lot of low-hanging fruit as a researcher. Compared to species like salmon, we know relatively little. And this is probably because forage fish are really small, so they're very hard to study. They're hard to put trackers on, they're hard to find. They move vast distances in their life cycles. There's overall a general lack of commercial fisheries for them here in BC. So there just hasn't been as much government pressure to study these fish. And lastly, forage fish just simply aren't sexy. They're a little hard to sell relative to, say, a grizzly bear or a orca whale.
Yes, forage fish have never really received the same research attention as many of the species they support. If you search the scientific literature, you'll find thousands of studies on Pacific salmon. Forage fish, only a fraction of that.
Yeah, and I'm going to walk you through Semantic Scholar and some screenshots of a peer review research journal search engine. So if you pop anything into the search bar of this web page, you'll get returns of any research paper that mentions this species. So if you pop in Oncorhynchus, which is the scientific name for salmon, you get 37,000 research papers that talk about salmon. And if you pop in, can you hit the next one, Gwen? Yeah, if you pop in Ursus horribilis, that's the scientific name for grizzly bear, you get about 12,000 papers. Not as much as salmon, but like a fair, solid body of research. If you put in Culpia pallasii, that's the scientific name for Pacific herring, you get only 4,500 research papers that talk about herring. And if you pop in Amidites personatus, that's the scientific name for Pacific sand lance, a common forage fish species here in BC. You only get 1,600 papers. And if you pop in Hypomesis pretiosus, that's the scientific name for surfsmelt, poor surfsmelt, you only get 845 research papers. So very few even mention the name of surfsmelt.
It's remarkable that there's such little research on forage fish, considering that these fish sit at the intersection of some big challenges we are facing along our coast, from biodiversity loss to shoreline development to climate change.
Yeah, so this means that these knowledge gaps aren't just staying in the scientific domain. It's not just simply that scientists don't have the research. It means that decision making is harder, and it shows up in everyday decisions that we make, particularly through like governments and land managers. So imagine if you for a day worked at DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And let's say that you were reviewing a development proposal for a project that would alter a shoreline. Let's say that there's a road that's eroding, or someone has submitted a proposal to build a marina jetty. If you don't already know that that shoreline happens to support fish and, let's just say forage fish, any fish, the Federal Fisheries Act can't apply. And federal decision makers can't take that species into account. They can't say that that work can't go ahead, or they can't say that you have to make certain mitigation actions in order to account for the loss of that habitat or damage to that habitat because of that project going ahead.
So, Jack, what do you think are some of the biggest forage fish questions we're still trying to answer?
You're just full of all the good questions, Gwen. This is tricky. I think the biggest question I see is, how are forage fish populations doing? What's like their status? Are they growing? Are they stable? Or are they in decline? We really don't know. We have some idea for Pacific herring, and that's probably because they are commercially harvested species. But for the rest of the forage fish here in BC, we really have very little idea. This question, I think, of how are they doing is followed very closely by where are they? Another question that is poorly understood, but I think that Project Watershed in particular is really well placed to answer this, and we're one of the few organizations actually working on it. Addressing where are forage fish allows us to identify important questions about where this habitat is, therefore it could then be protected in that example that I gave earlier. And it will allow us to help ensure that their habitat persists in the face of, say, new pipelines or projects of national interest. But what about you, Gwen? What do you think are the most important questions?
I think for me, one of the biggest questions is how people and forage fish can coexist. We all love living near the water, including myself. Yet that means that there's a lot of development along our coastlines. And at the same time, forage fish are just trying to do exactly what they've always done. Surf smelt spawning on our beaches, herring and kelp, eulachon in the rivers. And then we add climate change into the mix with rising sea levels, more intense storms, and marine heat waves. There are additional pressures on our coastlines. So the question I keep coming back to is, how do we do better? We already know how to use soft shore approaches, which are great alternatives to seawalls. So I'm wondering, how can we do more of that and do it better? Especially when I think of ports and eroding properties. How can we develop our shorelines in ways that make them more resilient for both people and wildlife?
Yeah. So here's some examples of some of that kind of shoreline development that Gwen was just referring to, where these seawalls change the habitat. And that could be both in the form of these lock block walls, or what you can think of along Stanley Park, but also these riprap walls. Sometimes they're right underneath roads. So this, I think, brings us to our next slide, which is about the 3 pillars of Project Watershed's work. And we're trying to understand where forage fish are, close knowledge gaps, and do what we can to make sure that these species stick around. Our work has 3 main pillars. We have monitoring work, research, and restoration, and they all tie in together.
Yeah, and it all started with monitoring. Project Watershed's forage fish work goes back almost 25 years already.
Yeah, and so the first species that Project Watershed started taking notice of in the family of forage species, or happy meals, is civic sandlance and surf smelt. And they started to take notice of these species because both of them happen to spawn on beaches, and that habitat is very accessible. It's quite literally in our own backyards.
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite facts about these fish. They don't spawn out in the open ocean like most other fish. They actually lay their eggs right here on our beaches.
Yeah, they're really eclectic, and I think that it makes them interesting. Sandlance, let me introduce them to you. They are quite small and skinny. They're about finger-sized, maybe a little bit bigger than that. And they lay their eggs in the winter months, very close to Christmas, which makes for some challenging field work. And what makes them particularly odd is that just like bears, they have a winter dormancy period and they rest all winter buried in coarse sandy substrates. And sometime in the middle of this like sleepy period, they wake up, don't really know what the cue is yet, and they go, ha, it's time to spawn. Let's go to the beach. And I just think that's hilarious. Here's a photo of Pacific sandlance eggs. If you look closely, you can see these round bubbles, and each one is attached to grains of sand. Each one is about 1 millimeter in diameter, so that's the same size as the writing on a penny.
Yeah, surf smelt are a little different. They are slightly larger than Pacific sandlands and prefer coarser sediments, so pebbly and gravelly beaches. And unlike sandlands, they can spawn throughout the year, although some populations peak in late winter and others in late summer. Surf smelt also have a fascinating history on our coast. There once was a commercial surf smelt fishery in BC that peaked in 1904 with harvest of over 230 metric tons before harvest declined to just 10 metric tons by the 1960s. Today, there's no commercial fishery in BC anymore, although you can still harvest surf smelt recreationally, but just across the border in Washington State, there's still an active commercial fishery.
Yeah, and so surf smelt, along with other forage fish species like herring, anchovy, and eulachon, used to be harvested by indigenous populations in volumes that rivaled and sometimes exceeded salmon. That fact blew my mind away. So here we're showing you a drawing of Kitsilano Beach back in 1861. And apparently the sketch is one of the earliest known sketches of the Vancouver area. And lo and behold, it's a sketch of people fishing for surf smelt. And there's some really interesting work in the archaeological world where archaeologists have been working with First Nations. And one project in particular, they were working with Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and they were going to middens and fire pits and looking at what traces of DNA they can find from the fish that were being eaten. And they were trying to ask what species were people consuming and how much of it. So which species are being consumed the most? And what they found was that surf smelt populations were once way more abundant than they are today. And in fact, they believe that surf smelt have lost up to 99% of their once very abundant population.
Wow, 99%. Crazy. And yeah, despite the historical abundance, we've never found surf smelt eggs north of Saanich since community science effort began almost 25 years ago, which is a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, I think this really highlights the importance of community science networks because we're catching this, and these kind of things would just totally fall through the cracks otherwise.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll give you guys a bit of background on the community science effort. And it all started way back about 25 years ago with biologist Ramona de Graaf. Some people might know her name. She's sort of one of the founding biologists of this field here in Canada. And she learned how to do this work from Dan Pantilla down in Washington State. And she went down there to learn how do you look for forage fish on beaches. And she brought this knowledge back up here to the Canadian side of the Salish Sea, and she went around teaching nature groups and streamkeepers groups how to do this work. And so this is a really cool example of like an organic citizen science movement taking off before citizen science was cool.
Yeah, and now we call it the Coastal Forage Fish Network. And the network now has more than 77 organizations with over 450 volunteers. And together we've conducted well over 5,000 surveys and discovered forage fish eggs on more than 143 beaches. And yeah, this work is only possible because so many people have contributed their time and knowledge over the years, because you might be surprised how labor intensive the search for forage fish eggs is if you haven't done it yet.
Yeah, it really is a very intensive process. And if for every 15 minutes of beach work, there's about 2 to 4 hours of microscope work looking for those eggs in sand. But this is the beauty of a community science effort, is that hundreds of people can go out to areas they know really well, and they can bring in that local knowledge. And they can simultaneously collect samples across a vast area and follow a standardized method. And everyday people can contribute and have a hand in the science. Yeah, it's a really impressive system.
Yeah, let's chat a bit more about the research next, Jack.
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite parts of this is all those years of the community science monitoring didn't go unnoticed. And in fact, researchers from DFO, Cliff Robinson, he started collaborating with us at Project Watershed. And I'd like to walk you through the next slide, which is all about modeling. And that is a technique that we really took advantage of here at Project Watershed, and through working with DFO and universities has really helped us move our programs, our research programs forward. And so what is modeling? Well, it's a computer science approach marrying biological field observations with like big data. And one particular model that we developed is Pacific Sandlands intertidal spawning habitat on the Canadian side of the Salish Sea. So we wanted to know where is spawning habitat and burrowing habitat on the Canadian side of the Salish Sea. And for that, we took this modeling approach. And to do that, we took those citizen science egg observations of where were eggs being found on beaches. And here's a little photo of what those eggs look like. And we mapped them across the Salish Sea. And we add that to a suite of environmental predictors. So these are things that describe the environment. So things like what is the fetch? What is the sediment type? What direction does a beach particularly face? And how much current is there? So we take all that information and you stack it up together and in these layers and there's like massive spreadsheets that you can pass on to these computer modeling softwares. And you pop it all into this algorithm. And what you get is a heat map. And before I go on, I just want you all to know that this data is publicly available. So we try to make all of our models open access and everyone can go on and use them. Yeah, take it away, Gwen.
Yeah, good point. It's all publicly available. Yeah, and here's the map we built. It predicts where we are the most likely to find suitable habitat in the intertidal zone for Pacific Sandlands. And as you can see, it's a heat map. It covers all of the Salish Sea. We've just zoomed in here to show you just the Courtney and the Comox area.
Yeah, and what you're seeing in this heat map of Sandlands habitat is areas that are red or warmer are more likely to have Sandlands spawning and burrowing habitat. And so these are often in areas that have lots of sand, they're really nice beaches, not very much silt. And so areas that are blue or cooler are areas that are less likely to have habitat for Sandlands. And so these tend to be areas like estuaries where you get a lot of silt. And what's special about this kind of map, this model, is that it really clearly delineates where this habitat is across a wide area. So we did the entire Salish Sea. And this allows managers to review potential proposed projects and determine, is there habitat here? You can use it to assess where are areas most at risk of an oil spill. And you can use it to identify where are areas we would like to conserve and ensure that this habitat remains. You can also use it in making models for other species. So like all those predators that we talked about at the beginning, you could use it to look at where are you more likely to find these predators or what habitat is important to the predators, because of course they depend on the forage fish species.
Of course they do. We also supported the development of a similar model built by Cliff Robinson and Beatrice Proudfoot at DFO, which covers the subtidal habitat. Because sandlands actually spend most of their lives buried in coarse sandy sediment at the bottom of the ocean. They like to hide there from predators and spend their winter dormancy, and that's also where they spend summer nights when they aren't feeding.
Yeah, and I like to think of this habitat as critical habitat for sand lance. They simply wouldn't exist without this habitat. Because sand lance don't have a swim bladder, and we didn't mention this earlier, but that's another thing that makes them really unique. Most fish have a swim bladder that allows them to control where they are in the water column. Sand lance don't, and they compensate for that by burrowing into these coarse sandy substrates, but they have to be silt free and they have to have access to them. So yeah, one thing that we did learn from these modeling efforts is that this habitat is patchy, uncommon, and rare. So it's not very common in the Salish Sea and elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's what makes this kind of work so exciting. If we know that Pacific sandlands depend on these patchy, coarse sandy habitats for survival, then protecting these habitats means we can protect the species and help ensure Pacific sandlands are available for predators.
Yeah, and we know that decision makers are using this information because I've personally talked to some of the permitting biologists at DFO and at the BC province who look at, when someone proposes to build a dock or a marina or a port, it has to go through those biologists to get their review, and they will suggest whether or not the project goes ahead, or they'll suggest potentially mitigation measures. And we know that they go to these models to look at, is there likely to be forage fish habitat on these shorelines?
Which is awesome. Yeah, something that continues to evolve is how we look for these tiny fish. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, is a very sensitive technology that we can use to find forage fish habitat that we might have missed otherwise.
Yeah, I think this is particularly powerful because as species move through their environment, they're constantly sloughing off little signals, little bits of DNA all the time. So this could be in slime or scales, or if they're laying eggs. We can pick up those signals, and simply we'll only have to collect some sand or a little bit of water. And for any cryptic species that is really hard to find otherwise, that is good at hiding from us when we are out there looking for them, this has been a total game changer.
Exactly. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, eDNA allows us to survey remote beaches more quickly and collect information across larger areas than would be possible using conventional methods alone. But Jack, I'd love to talk a bit more about the open water, where forage fish spend the time feeding and not trying to become someone else's lunch.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is the pelagic project is something that we've been working on for a long time. We have this vision of creating a Pacific sand lance habitat suitability models for the intertidal zone, the subtidal zone, and the open pelagic waters. But this project actually grew to be even bigger than just sand lance. And it was led by Sami Al Khalifa, our spatial data analysis, and we co-authored it with some folks at DFO, U of Vic, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And this was cool work because it leveraged partnerships and working with other people using data that was already collected. And it was built using the juvenile Pacific salmon survey trawls. And this is where DFO goes out. They've gone out for the last 23 years and caught trawls of juvenile salmon. So they're trying to understand where are the salmon, where are they moving, how are they doing? But they often catch other species as bycatch. And although juvenile salmon are a forage fish in their own right, we were trying to just focus on these other species listed here. So anchovy, eulachon, sand lance, whitebait smelt, and surf smelt, and then all other smelts. There's actually 11 subspecies from this family. And other species were caught in 2,600 trawls. And we were trying to answer 3 questions. So one is, where do you regularly, over these 23 years, always catch other forage fish species? 2, is there anything particularly unique about the ocean conditions in these areas where you regularly catch them? Say the nutrients or the oxygen or the temperature, current levels. Can we find these oceanographic conditions that are specific to the areas you find the fish? And 3, If there are those relationships that exist between where you find them and the oceanographic conditions, can we then use that to predict out to other areas that are not being sampled?
It is such a beautiful map. I love seeing where the hotspots show up. These are all areas with a lot of current and upwelling, where zooplankton is the most abundant, or areas where rivers meet the ocean, bringing those more land-based nutrients like nitrogen.
Yeah, it is a really beautiful map. Have you hit next slide, Gwen?
Ah, there it is.
Yeah, okay, it wasn't showing up for me. Yeah, so it's a really cool output map, and just like the intertidal and the subtidal sand maps, this is a heat map. And the cool use of this kind of map is that you can use it to identify priority areas for restoration.
Yeah, exactly. For example, is Patricia Bay Beach. In the 1920s, Patricia Bay Beach was a beautiful sandy beach, but when a road was built nearby, it changed the natural movement of sediment from the land to the sea. So over time, most of the sand was lost and the beach became much coarser. And unfortunately, that's a story we see again and again along our coastlines.
Yeah, so shoreline development can change how sediment moves from the land to the sea or along shorelines in the sea. And that can cause changes to the sediment and resulting in a loss of habitat for forage fish little by little. Thankfully for this story in particular, Patricia Bay Beach, this has actually been restored by peninsula streams and nearby nations.
Yeah, and another great example of a successful restoration project is the work we did with partners in Nymph Point Park, which is a beautiful little pocket beach, but it's also a lot more than that. Nymph Point Park is a place of deep cultural significance for the Salish peoples, and it's also one of the few beaches where both surf smelt and Pacific sandland spawn. And it's actually one of the most northern surf smelt spawning sites we currently know on the BC coast. So it's the kind of place where restoring natural shoreline processes benefits dozens, if not hundreds of other species.
Yeah. And what I love about this project is it really demonstrates the three pillars of our work coming together. Nymph Point Park was first identified as having suitable habitat by the community scientists who have been going out and looking for forage fish eggs in the beach. And then the habitat suitability models that we've been working on have identified this area as particularly hot and having lots of suitable habitat. And through the monitoring work led by the Coastal Forage Fish Network, so our partners, Peninsula Streams and Shoreline Society, they started noticing that parts of this beach were particularly degraded.
Yes, over time, invasive plants had taken over most of the backshore. Erosion was exposing culturally significant materials. There was an old creosote log ramp that was contaminating the beach, and there was even an abandoned sailboat that was resting on the shoreline, as you can see here.
Yeah, and though the beach was still supporting excellent spawning habitat for sandlance and surf smelt, despite the pressures that Gwen was describing. And so we were really worried that there could be a complete loss of this suitable spawning habitat if we didn't take some action.
So yeah, together with our many partners listed here, we decided to stabilize the eroding backshore using nature-based bioengineering techniques. We removed invasive species and planted around 1,000 square meters of native vegetation. And we also removed the creosote log ramp and the abandoned sailboat, which is why you can see all of this clean sand here. And we built a new staircase to guide visitors away from sensitive habitat. Maybe, Jack, can you lead us through the before and after photos?
Yeah. So here we're seeing that pathway that Gwen mentioned in the top photo. You can see where it's being eroded, and that it's the nearby plants are starting to be lost because of this erosion. So this beautiful staircase on the bottom photo shows the replacement of that eroding path line. And then here in the next slide, this is where some of the erosion was happening and invasive species. In the top photo, you can see English ivy growing. And you can also kind of see that this bank is concave, and that's where a lot more material was being removed from the backshore. And for that area, we replaced it with live willow wattle fencing, pictured below, which is a really cool feature using live willow stakes and adding additional other species in between on each of these terraces.
Mm-hmm.
And for this last photo of the restoration work, here you can see the sailboat and that creosote log ramp in the top. And down below, you see this beautiful new, fresh, clean sand, bringing this, removing a lot of those invasive species and removing those, the boat and the ramp.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I feel the before and after photos really say it all, don't they?
Yeah.
There was also a special moment in the middle of construction that happened. A group of students was walking through the site when surf smelt came right up onto the beach to spawn, as if they were checking in on our progress, and we caught it on film. So I will just try to play this for everyone.
It's cool. We don't have any sound showing, but you can definitely see the fish coming right up to the shore. And this video is on YouTube if you want to look for it yourself and to hear the sound. It's a quick clip, but they were in like just 20 to 30 centimeters of water, dropping their eggs like feet away from the group of people doing the work.
Yeah, pretty neat that happened. Yeah, so we're doing restoration, yet sometimes it feels like we're still just scratching the surface here in BC. Then we look south of the border at the work happening in Washington State, for example. I can't help but feel inspired by what's possible. They have been restoring forage fish habitat throughout Puget Sound for decades. Jack, why do you think we aren't seeing more of that here yet?
Well, we're probably 50 to 20 years behind Washington. They've already been restoring dozens of beaches. And not only are they preventing new seawalls or shoreline damage from occurring, because they have this no net loss standard that legally protects forage fish habitat, they're actually removing kilometers, well, maybe I should say miles, of seawalls. And that's what you can see here in these pictures. So on the before and after photos, the top one, this is a park in Seattle where there was this distinct large seawall, and what was happening is that it was eroding the material, and so as big waves would come in, that energy has to go somewhere, so some of it would splash up and some of it would go down, and it would grab the sand and pull it off the beach, and so you see the coarsening and hardening of the beach with these big rocks here. And then they remove that, and down below you can see that it's now a bit more of a gradual slope and no big coarse cobble anymore. And then this photo on the other side with the excavator is just another photo of them removing a seawall on McNeil Island, and they're just picking up all these lock blocks and getting rid of them.
Yeah, which is amazing. We already know restoration works, and we're starting to do it more here. So yeah, it feels less like asking if we should be doing this work and more like asking how can we do more of it.
Yeah, exactly. For decades, we've been engineering our coast to hold still, but we know that healthy shorelines actually are really dynamic places, and they are particularly hard to hold them still. And so I think the challenge that we're continuing to chip away at is ensuring that this knowledge and these tools, like the models, are available to decision makers and managers. And that way, development in coastal squeeze doesn't have to eat up priority forage fish habitats that will help our coast be more resilient in the face of climate change and species loss. And I think taking action on restoration projects where it is needed the most will help us drive the biggest impacts.
Yes. So where should we go from here, Jack?
Well, yeah, I don't think we're running out of research questions anytime soon. It is a really tricky time for us funding-wise. We're currently in between grants, and we have recently submitted some new ones where we're hopeful that we can get some funding to develop a Pacific herring spawning habitat suitability model. We're also hoping to look into some new eDNA methods, both for herring, but also for sand lance and other species. We're also looking for funding to take our intertidal monitoring citizen science program and build it out a little bit more, so it's a bit more focused on shoreline health. And finally, we've spent the last 3 years collecting a lot of data on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where we're going to replicate both the intertidal and subtidal models, and we want to turn those or make those into models and make that data available.
Lots of great ideas. We are also hoping to talk more with our partners about what future restoration projects could look like. Because imagine if every time an old seawall reached the end of its life, we could rebuild the shoreline naturally instead.
Oh my God, what a dream. And that just seems like such a modern take on future development.
Yeah, well, I hope we've convinced you that forage fish deserve a little bit more of your attention. But I think for today, Jack, we've done enough forage fish nerding out. So thanks everyone for listening and for joining Jack and I's conversation today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.